Hey guys, I haven't done a video in a minute, and I decided to do this video because I had a good number of questions about some of the training I did recently. So, I've been super busy, and I just recently finished my commercial pilot's license, and I'm moving on from commercial to my multi-engine commercial add-on, and then after that, I have my CFI school that I have to attend in order to get my CFI through the ATP program. So I had a couple questions, and I figured, I made a little short list of things I wanted to answer, some tips, some of the stuff that helped me, and just some of the ideas that I think might help some people. I'll try to make it short, try to be as brief as possible. So as far as the process goes, altogether, after getting my private's license through the PPL, with my PPL, I took about a year to get my PPL. I went through a small Part 61 school in Torrance, and I was working while trying to do my PPL at the same time, so that took a good amount of time. Then I decided to go with ATP, and that's a full-time program. So altogether, to get my instrument rating and to get my commercial, it took about, I'd say about 4 months, almost 4 months. Yeah. Um, I came in with about 80 hours, and right now I'm sitting at about 260 hours. You need the 250 hours in order to get your private, in order to get your commercial. At least 10 hours of that needs to be either in complex, high performance, or TAA, which is the technologically advanced, which is what they do at ATP. So we just did 10 hours of training and flying in a G1000 Cessna 172, which is pretty cool. It's nice to go from, we have all steam gauges. I know some of them have all G1000s, which is pretty awesome. But for us, we have all steam gauges, and we just spend the 10 hours doing the advance. So it's nice to be able to fly with autopilot and all the fancy glass cockpit, which is really nice. Um, I spent about 50 hours in the simulator, or the AATD. Most of that was during instrument, so I did about 40 hours of instrument simulated flight in the AATD, and then 10 hours of maneuvers in the commercial phase. So that got me to my 250 right there, and the rest was just all flying in the plane. The majority of that was instrument flying. And then they have like a cross country phase or not a cross country, crew phase, where in a crew phase you basically team up with another instrument rated student, and you guys just go fly, which is pretty cool because you don't. It's nice to have a break from just constantly doing maneuvers, constantly learning, and you just kind of get relax. You plan the trip, you deal with flight ops, they tell you where to go, and then you basically do everything else. You tell them how you're going to get there, you tell them how much fuel, you check the weather, you tell them how the weather is, and they okay it, and you just go fly. So that was always fun. It's nice to have like a co-pilot, help with comms, help with GPS and navigation. So that's pretty cool. But it does get a little tiring. One of the great things, and one of the things that does suck about doing a school like ATP is it's every day. It is every day. It can wane on you a bit. Especially during the instrument phase. I think the instrument phase is like the worst phase because it just literally just goes on and on and on. You know, it literally is like they feel like it's like 100 hours or more of just staring at instruments and being under the hood. It sucks. I think the instrument phase was definitely one where it was like, if I had money and just wanted to fly, I probably would never have done instrument. It's good to have. It does make life a little easier, but it's a long slog. So if you're doing instrument, just stick with it. You'll get it. It sucks now, but you'll get over it soon. As far as cost goes, I say right now, before the completion of the program, about 60,000 into it. Yeah, maybe a little less than 60,000. It's an expensive career path. When all said and done, I'll easily be 80 grand into it, not even including interest and finance fees and all that good stuff. So I got Sally Mae financing, so I'll be paying that off for a good minute. And then basically I want to get into the check ride. So a lot of people ask me about the check ride. The check rides are stress because check rides and tests are the most stressful part of flying. The written tests, they just seem so abstract. They seem like they're such a pain in the butt. I always stressed about the test. Every time I took a test, I was just like, fuck, I gotta take this test. I can't wait to not have to take any tests. You're always gonna be taking tests in aviation. If you're not doing your freaking uh, commercial, you're doing your multi. If you're not doing your multi, you're doing your CFI. If you're CFI, you're gonna constantly fucking recertify. If you do your ATP, you gotta recertify. If you have ratings, every 2 years you still have to do your flight reviews. And if you go to the big boys, every year you gotta recertify in jet and all that other stuff. So you're always gonna be doing tests. You just don't want to stress about it, and you'll be fine. It takes a minute to really just realize that there's a thing about it that it's not as stressful as people make it out to be, and it's not as stressful as you should make it out to be. I made that mistake many a times where I just kind of stress out about it, and then once I get it over with, I'm just like, okay, that really wasn't as bad as I thought it was. For example, weather. A lot of people stress about weather because weather is just so much information. You could be a master of weather and never touch any of the other subjects when it comes to aviation. But in the few check rides that I've done, I think I've never had more than maybe like 3 or 4 weather questions. Even in my commercial check ride, my DPE, he only asked me like, what kind of fronts are there? He asked me, what kind of fog do we normally get in the area? He asked me, how, what's required for a freaking thunderstorm or convective activity to occur. What's a dew point? Basic stuff like that. He didn't really go into it where I was like, oh my god, I gotta look it up. So it wasn't that terrible as far as weather, which is a very stressful part. So as far as the check ride goes, as far as subjects, so my check ride was pretty laid back. My commercial check ride was about an hour. Or I should say the oral was about an hour, and the flying portion was 1.2 hours. He's a real good guy. One of the cool things about being at ATP is you get the same. It seems like you pretty much get the same examiners over and over again, so you build a rapport with them. When I first saw him, he was really cool. He was a bit of a dick the first time I saw him, but the second time I saw him, he was pretty laid back, and he was like, "Hey, didn't I do your instrument check ride?" And I was like, "Yeah, you did." And he's like, "Yeah, you're from Connecticut, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Yeah, I have family in Connecticut." And he's like, "Yeah, I've been through there." So you build a little bit more of a rapport with them, so it's a little more laid back. It's a little less stressful. But of course, the DPs, they get paid to be professionals, so he's gonna go through the process, the paperwork, and he's gonna ask you what questions. Just like any DP or any student I ever met, go through the ACS. He's gonna go line by line through the ACS and pick out the questions he wants to ask you. He can't ask you anything more that's not in the ACS or anything less that's not in the ACS. So if you've been studying the ACS, if you've been studying your oral guide, nothing should really be a surprise. So he's a cool guy. We went over some basic stuff. One of the things, because there's 2 major things that I always tell people to make sure you understand this and make sure you really get on it, is one, don't neglect the little things. One of the things that I was very surprised that it even took me a second, and then I was like, oh my god, I'm blanking on it, and I really had to take the time and think about it and review, was small things such as chart symbology. Despite being instrument rated, having little 250 hours, spending all this time in a plane and doing all this navigation, there were a couple questions that were basic questions that really, it took me a second to think about. One of them was, we were going through the charts and chart symbology, and he picked out an airport that had a frequency in italics, and he's like, what is this frequency? And so, despite looking at charts, I hadn't looked at a VFR chart in a minute. I've been doing tons of IFR flying, and they really push ForeFlight and being able to know that, and systems. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at it and I'm like, huh. I blanked. I was like, you know what? Let me look this up real quick. You know, I'm pretty sure this is one of the either the freaking CTAF or maybe Unicom. So I had to look it up, and I was like, oh yeah, it's the Unicom. It's a Unicom frequency. I hadn't looked at it in so long. It just didn't dawn on me. So make sure you go back and review your basic chart symbology. The next thing was what was the other one he asked me about that I had to look up again? Airspaces. Now we always cover different airspaces. You know, we drill in the class Alpha, the class Golf airspaces, but then he was picking out some small spaces where he was like, hey, what are the other different types of spaces? And I'm like, okay, I know MOAs, I know warning, I know prohibited and restricted. And he's like, all right, what are the others? And I'm like, others, you know? And he's like, I want you to list all of them for me. And I'm like, you know what? I'm blanking right now. Let me review it real quick. And he's like, yeah, go ahead. He goes, because he knew that we're not going to remember every goddamn airspace. And I'm like, oh, national security airspace, you know, little shit like that. And I'm like, all right. So review your chart symbology, you know, definitely know those little things you think as a commercial you're going to be dealing with. Oh, what is it? You know, tell me jet speeds, tell me all this, you know, FAR stuff and all this like really advanced stuff, when really you're going back to your private days. They want you to be able to fly VFR and understand VFR as a private pilot even more than you did when you did your PPL. So think of it as a PPL with slightly more advanced knowledge is what he told me. You know, it's basically private, but we hold you to a slightly higher standard as far as knowing your information and the maneuvers. So that brings me to my next point. So one of the things that it definitely took me a minute to realize, and you should always take this to heart, never volunteer information you're not certain about. Oh my goodness. When I think of how many times just in life that would have helped me, never volunteer information you're unsure about. One of the key things I've found that will help you that is not digging yourself into a hole. Basically, sometimes you're going to come across questions in which you may not be 100% solid about. You may have some key points, but it's better to miss a few key points and request to review it, or to request to you know, to back up your information, than it is to start volunteering information and basically dig yourself into a hole. You know, for example, we talking about airworthiness. You know, basically, so one of the questions you're most likely going to get about airworthiness is, let's say there's a ramp check and you have an FAA official who wants to know if your plane is airworthy. You know, he's going to say, what are some of the things you're going to need to make sure that's on that plane in order to make sure that it's airworthy. So you can start by saying, okay, you need aero, right? Keep it simple. And I had, like, when I did my instrument, and I said, oh, aero. That was it. As soon as I said aero, he was like, okay, I know you know it, good. Where with the private, with a private and commercial, when I said aero, he was like, all right, and what's that? Then you start breaking it down. If you start going in there and you're just like, oh, you're going to need maybe your registration, maybe your airworthiness certificate, and you start, you know, scrounging for answers outside of just the basic, that's when you start digging yourself into a hole, you know, because maybe you'll say something like, oh, I don't know, maybe a minimum equipment list, and then that's going to trigger him to be like, okay, wait a minute, you said minimum equipment list. Let's talk about that right now. He goes, it's not quite what I was asking, but you brought it up. Let's talk about it. And then you're just like, fuck, why did I even open my mouth for that shit? Now I need to go into MELs. So, you know, keep to the simple, concise answers. You know, it's best for you to just give him a simple answer. And if you're missing something, he may probe a little more. He'll be like, is that it? Are you sure? And then you're like, okay, let me double check. I know it. I just can't think of it right now. It's best to say that than it is to just be like randomly spouting off what you think are facts and you're just completely off the point. So that's one of my key advice for anybody who's taking any sort of exam, oral exam, flight review, whatever. Don't volunteer information that you're not certain about. Keep it very simple and let the examiner probe you. Let him ask the questions, not you volunteer stuff for him to ask you about. It's very important. So other than that, the oral went pretty well. We talked about some airplane systems. We talked about national airspace. We talked about a few weather minimums. So make sure you know all those numbers. We pretty much went through all of them. Make sure you know the entry requirements. We talked about that. What else did we talk about? We talked about some basic systems such as a vacuum system, the pitot, the static system. So make sure you understand those instruments. Definitely remember your V speeds. As a commercial or private, even instrument, you got to know your V speeds. I made sure to drill that V speeds. I even went and I freaking we have like a supplement that they give us for the 172, and I reviewed that, and I noticed some of the numbers were off. So I just went, okay, look, forget that. I went to the POH and I reviewed the numbers in the POH for the plane that I was flying, and boom, that was it. For any time, let's say you have a number that's off. Let's say, for example, one of the things that we talked about recently throughout the entire school is the short field takeoff. The short field takeoff has varied numbers, and it varies by plane. So you can't really have a standard number. We had this on our 172 supplement. It was kind of weird where they said that you should rotate in order to climb out and clear your 50-foot obstacle at 56 knots. Where I've had one flight instructor say you should rotate in order to get off the ground as soon as possible. I've read one POH where it was like you should rotate at 48 knots and climb out at 58 knots. And then, I asked the examiner about it because I knew all these other numbers, and I was like, I don't want to bust because I do a wrong speed, and I want to make sure that we are on the same page as far as which speed that we should do. And he was like, what is in the POH for this plane? And I said, in the POH for this plane, I made sure to look it up. It said, rotate for maximum weight at 51 knots and climb out at 57 knots. And then he said, use the numbers for the POH for the weight for this plane. So even if, in general that this should be the number, use this. He goes, go through the POH. I had another examiner tell me when I was doing my PPL, he goes, if you go by the POH, I can guarantee you will pass, So don't neglect just because maybe you haven't seen that plane before, maybe, you switch planes, take a second and review the POH and review the numbers. You're going to want to know those for that specific plane. He can't knock you, and if you're like, oh, well, that number doesn't make sense, and you just like, hey, this is what it says in the POH, that's what he's going to go by. If he feels like a number's off, often he will be like, hey, where'd you get these numbers from? And then you just say, I got it from the POH. Here's a picture. Here's the POH itself, whatever. And he can't argue about that. So that's the oral. Don't be afraid to say, hey, you know what? Let me double check. Don't be afraid to say, I have a feeling I know what it is, but let me just do you mind if I look it up real quick to make sure? Every examiner I've had has been cool enough to be like, hey, you know it, but you're a little off. Maybe your phrasing's a little off. Maybe what you're saying is close, but not close enough. And don't be afraid to just be like, hey, let me look it up real quick. So that's the oral. So after the oral, you're going to have your practical or the flight. So we did the flight, for commercial, he was cool enough, he let me just pre-trip the plane without him there. I'd already pretty much pre-tripped it before, and I just did another pre-trip because we'd been sitting there for like an hour or two. Private, if you're doing your pre-trip, be very methodical. Go through the POH. Don't just use your little checkmate checklist. Make sure you have the POH with you when you're doing your walk around. It's very important that you're using the POH, which is, if you don't know, is the Pilot Operating Handbook. So make sure that you're on that when you're doing it. a lot of people fail their check rides because they make the mistake of they're inside the plane, they're doing their POH, they're doing their inside inspection, and then they're like, all right, I'm going to do my walk around. And what do? They walk away from the POH. They leave it on the seat and they start doing the walk around. So make sure you have that. And if you are going to be like, okay, I'm going to do the basics here from the POH, and then I have a printed checklist or a checkmate checklist, say that. They want to hear that. They want to know you know what you're doing. If you just start doing things and you don't say what you're doing, they're going to assume you don't know what you're doing. So I did that as well when I did my private. In my private, I did my walk around. I said, all right, I'm going to start with the POH, and then I like to use my checkmate because it's a little more detailed on certain aspects that the POH isn't. And he was like, okay, cool. So I had my checkmate checklist in my hand, and I did my walk around with that, and he was totally fine with it. But I had to communicate with him, and that's the important thing. Same thing with maneuvers. Before you start any maneuvers, before you do any maneuvers, he's going to tell you, he's not going to be like, hey, set up for this, or hey, get to this and do this. No. When I did my maneuvers in private, instrument, and freaking commercial, he's pretty much just going to be like, all right, let me see your stalls. Okay, let me see your slow flight. That's how he's going to be. He's not going to give you any tips. He's not going to give you anything like, he's not going to prod you. He wants to see that you know what you're doing. And unless you're doing something unsafe, he's going to let you mess up. He's going to let you do your thing. So just like with the oral, don't be afraid to communicate with your intentions. Don't be afraid to say, all right, give me a sec, let me just check this real quick, but more importantly, tell them what you're doing. When we go into slow flight, don't just like, okay, I'm going to pull power, and just start doing it. No, you're like, all right, slow flight, 1500 flaps, 110 below 110, verbalize everything. All right, within flap range, okay, 20, 30. All right, we're at like 60 knots, for commercial, they like to see it between 50 and 60 knots. So you're like, all right, I'm going to do like 55 knots. All right, 55 knots, power back in, and then I'm going to freaking cruise at this speed. Once he sees that you're telling him and you're verbalizing and you understand why you're doing it, then he's going to look on that favorably. And then basically, once you've set up, let's say slow flight, then again, he's just going to be like, all right, give me a turn to the left, give me a turn to the right, climb, descend. All right, he goes, do your power off real quick. And like for me, he was like, all right, do your power off real quick, and then right after your power off, transition into a power on. And I was like, okay. So I did power off, and for commercial, you don't have to do the whole break, you just do indication of a stall. So as soon as I got the horn, full power, he goes, got a positive rate, got to about 65, and increase that. He goes, got to about 65, flaps up, and then all I did was just increased that angle of attack to keep it at 65, had that maintain climb, and then just allowed it to go into that power on stall. As soon as got the first indication, boom, nose back down, real seamless, real quick. So one of the hardest things about the commercial check ride when it comes to flying is there are a lot of, I don't want to say there are a lot, there are a few more moves, but the hardest thing about it is realizing that it's not so much about just the precision of the moves. Your moves have to be intentional and they have to be precise, but more than anything, they have to be coordinated and fluid. That's the main thing. When you are, for example, doing a steep turn, it's real easy to kind of jerk it around, maintain that steep turn. You see you're going down, you want to jerk it back and bring it up, try to maintain that speed. When you're doing the commercial, it's all about being way more fluid. You want to, don't jerk it back a lot, because you realize that the delicate controls are so much easier when you don't over control the plane. So that's the main thing I think about when I think of going from private to commercial, is how much easier I can control the plane with fewer inputs by using correct inputs. If you start, let's say for example, chandelles can be pretty hard when you first start. It seems like it's a little weird. You're doing a lot of complicated maneuvers. You're looking for particular angles. You're looking for particular banks. And then when you really think about it, the hardest part of it is loosening your control on the plane. You want to hold the yoke. You want to make sure and maintain that. And you're just like, once he goes, my instructor told me, he's like, hey, the best way that you can get these done is think about the laziest way you can get it done. So, for example, you're doing the chandelle. The chandelle is a controlled turn where basically it's supposed to be like an old military maneuver where basically you're straight and level and you're going to bank the wings 30 degrees, then pull up to about 15 degrees or more and allow the plane to ascend while turning 180 degrees while maintaining minimal controllable speed. So it seems kind of complicated. You got to put in, he goes certain degrees. From the first 30 degrees you have to maintain a constant 30-degree bank, and then after that you have to maintain a constant pitch in order to maintain the speed. So it seems like it's a little complicated when you first do it. You want to over control. You're not putting in enough rudder input, so it can be a little bit of a pain. But the important thing to remember is you can do all these maneuvers with the tips of your fingers. Really, you don't have to grab and hold the yoke. You don't have to death grip it. Once you've done it a while and you've gotten used to it, you just it becomes as simple as, okay, you're starting your turn, 30 degrees of bank. You can just literally pull the yoke with your fingertips and it'll bank nice and easily. Once you get to that 30 degrees, you put in that power nice and smooth. You maintain that 30 degrees and you pitch that nose up slowly to that 15 degrees or so. And the plane will literally just smoothly cruise into that altitude. You're not jerking it back. And with all your maneuvers, whether it's the steep turns, whether it's your chandelles, whether it's your lazy eights, you can do pretty much all of these maneuvers by your fingertips. And just by learning that made me an immensely better pilot. Think of when you're in the pattern and you're coming to land. When you're turning from downwind to base to final, sometimes you may turn and you find that during your turn you're dipping below 500 feet per minute or you're pulling back on the yoke. Well, if you set your trim right, you pull that power to start your descent, you put in that flaps, you could let go of that yoke and that plane will smoothly cruise down the negative 500 feet per minute, and it will maintain that speed that you want it at. And when you want to make that turn, you use your fingertips and you just slightly pull that yoke to the left and the plane will turn as if you were freaking yanking it, and it will be nice and smooth. You make sure you put in that rudder input and you keep it coordinated. So just those little tips right there, just relaxing, being as lazy as possible, putting in as little input as possible and letting the plane really just fly itself will make your flying immensely better. So yeah, over controlling I think is the easiest way that you can fail. You're fighting the plane. Especially when you're going to the right side, because when you're going to the right side, you're gonna not put in enough rudder input. You're gonna want to bring that yoke back to the right because you're gonna feel like, or back to the left because you're gonna feel like you're over banking. But really, if you just hold that control, just let it do its thing and just give it minor input to maintain its attitude and its bank, the plane will do its maneuver nice and smoothly. Literally, the nature of physics will allow it to just do it on its own practically. When you're doing a steep turn and once you've got it dialed in, you can pretty much let go of the yoke and the plane will continue its steep turn on its own. You may have to put in light input, every now and then, but other than that, you can do all these maneuvers with your fingertips. So it's a little bit of a long video, like damn near 30 minutes, but those are my tips for Checkride. I'm real happy I passed my Checkride. It's been a long time coming. It's been a lot of studying. You know, I just recently passed my fundamentals of instruction written. I have to take my fundamentals, my flight instructor airplane written this next week. So I've been studying for that. I'm real excited to start multi. Should be starting at the middle of this next week. I'll start my multi-engine training. And then hopefully by the end of this month, I should start my CFI training. So me personally, I don't know if I really want to be a CFI, but it's good to have either way. You know, I'll most likely do like most, where I'll work as a CFI until you get to that 500 hour mark. And once you get to that 500 hour mark, a lot of jobs open up, and you can do a lot more. You can apply for a lot more companies. You can get into companies like Boutique Air or Suzy or Mokalele. They'll hire a lot of right seat guys at 500 hours. So, and even if you decide to fly small planes, you know, a lot of companies that have you flying small planes, and you're flying maybe a 172 and they only require 250 hours minimum, a lot of them look much more favorably on you if you have the CFI than if you don't. So if you're considering continuing on, you got your commercial, you're looking at getting your commercial, look at going directly into CFI. You know, keep that knowledge fresh. Keep it, you know, quick and concise if you can, and you'll be fine. So, you know, I'll keep you guys informed. If I can get some cool videos in the multi, I'll try and post it up. And thanks for sticking out to the end of the video. I'll talk to you guys later.